Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. This panel discussion is sponsored by the BrainHub, which is an initiative to bring together scientists and engineers across campus who are interested in brain function. And today we're going to talk about the intersection between computer science and neuroscience with the overall question of how close are we to being able to replicate human cognitive functions in a machine, and what do we need to know from the biology to be able to do that? So I have four distinguished panelists to introduce you to today. Sandy Kuhlman, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences in the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition. She's been here for, I think, almost 4 years, 3.5 years now. And she's using next-generation approaches to imaging large numbers of neurons in the rodent neocortex. She studies visual system plasticity. Wayne Wu is the associate director of the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition. He's a philosopher of mind and the author of studies about schizophrenia and auditory hallucinations, as well as a book about attention most recently. David Touretzky is a research faculty member in the Department of Computer Science, and his interests are in both computer science and education, as well as robots and brains. And Anind is the director for the Human-Computer Interaction Institute in the Department of Computer Science. So we're going to start off with a brief introduction from each one of our panelists about this question in general, and they have some audiovisual aids to show you, and then we'll discuss some particular topics. The last 15 minutes will be open for questions from the audience, and so if you think of something during the course of our discussion, write it down, and we'd love to take your questions. So, Sandy, why don't I let you start off?
Thank you, Alison. So I wanted to start off by saying, coming from the point of view of brain function as a biologist. And so one of the reasons why I love these types of discussions is the brain is really complex. It's made up of different cell types. So just like we have muscle cells, bone cells, that perform different functions. For example, your muscle cells move your skeleton around and your whole body's held together by skin cells. The brain is made up of different cells that perform different functions. So we know that. We also know that brain neurons are connected to each other. Some brain neurons are not connected to each other. So there's connections, synaptic connections between neurons. And also those synaptic connections can be strong or weak. So those are some fundamental properties of brains that we know, and we know a whole bunch of other properties about how proteins and molecules function in individual neurons. Given this complexity and kind of thinking in terms of what can we learn in our lifetime, I'm actually a little pessimistic that we can understand brain function in our life. So then the best strategy from my point of view is actually to come up with what are the good strategies to understand the brain. And so as neuroscientists, we're normally open to new ways of thinking about things. In fact, computational tools have been very helpful, and ultimately algorithmic understanding of things that look like consciousness could really help my research. But also you can think of algorithm basis of consciousness as a separate venue, which I think we'll hear from some of the other speakers. So there's kind of two purposes, but they might be synergistic. So where are we at in terms of biology and an algorithmic understanding or computational understanding? Well, very recently, a paper came out in Cell where a group in Europe, headed by Henry Markram, is actually attempting to simulate microcircuits of the brain. So they have, I believe it's about 300,000 neurons that they've digitally reconstructed and built into a microcolumn. And here you can see they're looking at different activities of these neurons, and they're connected, and they have synaptic connections that they started to build this simulation with some basic rules and understanding they had from experiments. And then they sort of let the algorithms form the final connections. And this is the type of thing they come up with. And I guess in the next movie, we can show the types of things that one could do with such a simulation. They can actually act, and it's a sensory part of the cortex that they're simulating. And they can essentially be the same thing as wiggling the whisker on a rodent and watch how the different patterns of activity form. So on that initial wiggle, you saw a burst of activity, and then it sort of resonates through the circuit. And interestingly, just from this first implementation of their simulation, they claim they've made some discoveries that using their algorithms, the connections sort of look like what we find in vivo, and some of the patterns of activity are actually represented from in vivo experiments. And that's very interesting, because that would suggest then that we know enough of microcircuit structure and that some of that microcircuit connectivity is actually sufficient to predict the flow of neural activity patterns in these very limited microcircuits. They also realized that their simulation did not recapitulate some of the activity patterns we see in vivo, and that is some of the spontaneous shifts in between a synchronized state and asynchronized state, which is very important for human consciousness, whether we're asleep or awake. So when you're asleep, you tend to have synchronized activity. When you're awake, it's less synchronized. So more work needs to be done, and they might be adding different brain areas and connections into that microcircuit. With that, I guess.
Great, thanks. You want to give it to Wayne?
So can you put my slides up then? So I want to start off by I really just want to pose some problems and possible solutions. So go to the first slide, there, the brain and mind, number 2. Nope. Number 2. Yeah. So this is a paper from Stanislav Dehaene and Shenzhou. And what you're seeing here is, one of the wonderful things that we can do nowadays, which is we have different ways of looking at brain activity. And here you're seeing a difference, the brain on the left versus on the right, between in a subject who in the left case hears a sound, in the right case does not. Now in the right case, you do see activity in the auditory areas of the brain, but the subject isn't conscious or doesn't hear the sound. And so this slide is meant to demonstrate something that's really difficult, which is how to understand how you go from brain activity to the generation of mental states like auditory states of hearing a sound. Right? So on their view, so they have a theory of consciousness, which is called the workspace theory. And the idea that they want to propose is that what makes for consciousness is that you broadcast this information broadly into the brain. And that's what they're inferring from this really broad activity that they're seeing in the brain. But the issue really is, well, why is that what generates consciousness or auditory experience? Okay, so it's not that every kind of brain activity gives rise to mentality, to psychological states. Right, so that's one question that we have to ask. We know that brain activity is necessary and sufficient for consciousness, but not all forms of brain activity are going to do it. This becomes hard then because on the one hand, we have neuroscientists who are trying to understand the nature of the brain, the circuits, the physical and electrical properties of the brain, the informational properties. And if you want to then bridge the gap to talk about, say, artificial minds or downloading or putting a mind into something like the different physical structure on the right side, you're right. How would you do it? Right, so we already have problems connecting the brain to the mind, and now there are going to be additional problems of connecting the brain to machine structures, and also machine structures to the mind. Next slide, please. How would you know that you've succeeded? So here is an intellectual hero to many of us, Alan Turing. Please advance. And I just want to remind you that in 1950, he wrote this brilliant paper. Right? It's called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. I'm reproducing for you the first page. He proposed there in the first section of the paper what's called the imitation game, what we now know as Turing's test. And I reproduced the first sentence of that paper, Turing's question, can a machine think? Next slide, please. The beauty of Turing's work, as many of you know, is that he precisely defined the notion of a machine for us, which is this idea of a digital computer or a Turing machine. Next slide. But the question of how do you know whether or not you've succeeded in producing, in this case, an artificial mind, nevertheless a mind, for him was a difficult question if you thought about defining what thinking is. Philosophers are really awful at definitions, right? So how are you going to do it? This is the brilliant move on his part. Here's a test. Imagine on the left you have A, which is an artificial mind, or what purports to be. On B, you have, in B, you have a real person, and C is the interrogator. So the test that Turing proposes, as many of you know, is that C is going to figure out, on the basis of providing questions to A or B, get those answers back from them, and assess, on the basis of that information, who's the human being. And for our purposes, if C is forced to essentially guess, in other words, if A really does a good job simulating a mind, then for Turing, that was essentially an affirmative answer to his original question. Can machines think? Sure. And the point of bringing up this test is that when we do all this sort of complicated stuff of trying to understand the brain, looking at different sort of circuits in the brain, trying to build an artificial mind, Turing provides, I think, a really interesting test for how we might figure out whether we've been successful or not. Last slide. And so that raises the question whether or not this sort of test is necessary and sufficient. If you don't like this test, and I suspect many of you may not like this test, what would you put in its place? I'll leave you with that question.
Okay, can I have my first slide? So artificial intelligence is like flight. People dreamed of flight for thousands of years. And they made bird costumes, they jumped off cliffs. That didn't do a whole lot of good. But eventually technology advanced far enough that we really can fly without cheating, and that's great. Likewise, people have dreamed for years of making intelligent mechanisms, but we don't have the technology yet to do that. And so the next best thing we can do is dress up in robot costumes for Halloween, or we can invent useful algorithms that do some useful tasks. And so while there has never been an artificial intelligence yet, I don't think that there will never be one, but we have never seen one for real. There have been a lot of great successes in artificial intelligence, the field, using specialized algorithms for things like game tree search, information retrieval, speech recognition, right? Your phone, you can talk to your phone now. Self-driving cars are coming, right? So these are all successes of specialized algorithms. If we can go to the next slide. That's not the next slide.
Sorry.
That's the next slide. So Watson, who handily beat human players in Jeopardy, is often held up as an example of how much progress we've made in artificial intelligence. But Watson is a collection of clever hacks that was engineered by a team of multiple PhDs who spent years getting this thing to work. And yet you cannot have a conversation with Watson. You can ask him questions if they look like Jeopardy questions, and he might say something good, or he might say something completely stupid that a human would never say, depending on how good the algorithm is. So there's actually a whole field of greasy hacks to pretend that we have intelligence when we don't. And that's the Lovejoy Prize, which is using these things called chatbots. So this is an attempt to pass the Turing test. Not really. It's an attempt to make us pretend that we're passing the Turing test by using greasy hacks. So here are some of the hacks, right? You can do this yourself. You have a prepared story that you insist on telling, whether the hearer wants to hear it or not. You repeat things the other person says, whether or not you understand them, because it sounds like you understand them. And if all else fails, you evade their question by changing the subject or asking them what they think. So if you read Turing's paper, and now if we can skip ahead to slide 6, please. So the paper that Wayne showed you the cover page of, if you actually look at what Turing said, he gave a sample dialogue between an interrogator and a computer, and what stands out is that the hypothetical computer doesn't use any of these sleazy hacks. It's actually damn clever, smarter than your average undergraduate. And so you can see here when he talks about this scanning of the sonnet, and then he switches to Mr. Pickwick. That's a Dickens character, right? So we've got references to classic literature. And then he comes back and tries this syllogism. Christmas is a winter's day. I don't think Mr. Pickwick would mind. He's trying to use a bogus argument, a faulty syllogism, and the computer comes back and calls him on it and says, you can't be serious. And explains exactly why the syllogism is wrong. It doesn't evade at all, right? This is what real intelligence looks like. Nobody knows how to do this, and we probably won't in my lifetime.
Great.
So in my institute, in my lab, we focus a lot on understanding people's behaviors and using technology to understand people's behaviors. And so Dave posed the question, I'm going to get a little bit off, but he posed the question that you couldn't interrogate which one was that? Was it Watson? That you couldn't interrogate Watson, you couldn't ask it questions, you couldn't have a conversation with it. And so in following sort of what Wayne was saying, is that a reasonable test of whether something is, whether that's sort of consciousness or AI? So in my lab, as I said, we focus on trying to understand people's behaviors through technologies. So if we could build a being, some kind of form that could walk the way your parent does. Let's take your mother. So walk the way your mother does, move the way your mother does, speaks the way your mother does. Would that be at least a representation of her consciousness? Can you play the first video?
This is Simsei or New Dimension?
The first, sorry, the second one. Not Simsei, the other one.
Okay.
So this is some work that was done by University of Southern California.
Do you remember any songs from your youth?
To remember it. It's in Polish. Jadą dzieci, jadą drogą.
Right, so we're having some jitter issues here, but
I nawidzić się nie mogą, jaki piękny świat.
so the interesting thing about this guy is that this is a real person. This is a representation of him. There's a project. Oh, you better cancel that because I have no idea what's coming up next. You never know what you're going to get on YouTube. So this is a project at University of Southern California where they are trying to essentially capture the life history of this gentleman who survived the Holocaust. And so it's some work with the Shoah Foundation. And what they're doing is they've got him in a room and under all sorts of different lighting conditions that he can't even perceive that there's different lighting conditions. So they can put different backdrops behind him. They're taking cameras from multiple images so that they can produce this 3D hologram. What you saw was an image of what that would be like with the ability to ask it questions. So this was on the Today Show just a couple weeks ago, where Matt Lauer, whoever's the guy on the Today Show now, could ask this gentleman a question, but it was asking this repository of information. And what was really cool about it was how the algorithm underneath it could combine details from a bunch of different responses he had given, sort of do the right head nods at the right spot, so that it gave you the impression that you were talking to this guy. Now, none of the people that were interacting with him knew him personally, so that it's not so clear whether this would be a very good representation, but at least it's a start of something that you could converse with. We'll just play just a tiny bit of the next one. This next one is some work done by...
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment.
So she's a virtual
I'm
therapist.
not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you.
You can see what she's
ask
seeing
a
on the
few
left-hand
questions
side
to get
here.
us started.
The facials,
And please
the
feel
body
free
pose.
to tell me anything. Your
Some of the
answers are totally
interpretations she's going to
confidential.
make are going to show down
Are you
here.
okay with this?
Yes,
So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
That's good. Where are you from originally?
It's a little awkward.
I'm from Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm from LA myself. When was the last time you felt really happy?
When was the last time?
So the idea here is that you have this virtual therapist, not so great, but a virtual therapist that uses a lot of technology, cameras, microphones, a lot of technology looking at the facial features, the way, the body pose, are they making eye contact with you? And this virtual therapist is reacting in real time to what the person on the other side is saying. And so there's a question there of whether these created essences, these created creatures, are in some way a form of AI, or at least are an important step to AI.
Great. So I want to tease out something between Anind and Dave here, because in some ways what you're saying is it doesn't really matter if it's intelligent, and in fact maybe most of us wouldn't really generate what is considered to be really deeply intelligent comments in most of our daily interactions. As long as we seem like we're making the right answer, responding the right way, providing the right responses, maybe that's enough. So Dave, what's the challenge here? When would you be satisfied with that sort of approximation?
Well, it depends on the task. So I'm not a therapist, but in grad school, my roommates were therapists. And so they were therapists in training. And so one thing I learned is that a major part of therapy is forming a supportive relationship with another person. And so even if the machine was able to say all the right things, if you didn't feel that you were relating to a person, you may not get the benefits. But the other issue, I think, is that this is a pretty shallow interaction, right? So you can make a script to handle a lot of shallow interactions, like you want to book a table at a restaurant, or you're introducing yourself to a new person, in this case a therapist, but you're going through the standard introductory monologue, that's fine, right? But if you've been in therapy for 6 months or 6 years, your therapist had better have a lot of insight into your personal beliefs and belief system and history, and they're not, if they could do that, they'd be passing the Turing test, right? They're not, this video, he's showing you the first 2 minutes, right? I want to know what the next 5 hours looks like. It's going to go bad real fast. And then you're back at the Loebner Prize level.
Wayne or Anna, do you want to respond to that?
So yeah, I definitely don't disagree with what Dave said. So this was meant to be provocative. I certainly wouldn't use that sensei as my personal therapist. But I do think it really highlights this interesting point of how real does something have to be in order for you to at least go beyond that sense of I don't want to interact with this thing. It's just fake. And from their studies and from their papers that they published, and in fact, one of the authors of this work is now a faculty member in LTI, LP Morency, Language Technologies Institute here at Carnegie Mellon. And the papers that they write seem very compelling to me in terms of how people are willing to sort of throw away their sense of disbelief and actually start to interact with these virtual therapists or these virtual characters. And at this institute at USC is amazing because they do stuff with the military and trying to do cultural awareness for our armed forces who are all over the world. And so they're able to get everyday people to sort of throw away that sense of disbelief and start engaging and interacting and feeling immersed in these kind of environments. And they do say, the first thing she said was, I am not a therapist, right? And so the whole point of this was actually to do sort of early screening or early detection if there's a problem. So I do think that, as Dave said, for certain tasks, these things definitely have their place.
I might just add to that the issue about task is really important. So if you go back to Turing's test, I mean, you might think that's a really high bar, right? Being able to carry on this conversation where you can really trick, a smart person on the outside interrogating, or being a good therapist. And you might say, well, maybe the way that we should approach these problems is to have a sort of more narrow view. So maybe what we should try and do is just emulate any kind of therapist, even bad therapists, right? I mean, if you could emulate a bad therapist and you'd recognize a bad therapist, that would be some achievement. Maybe it would be a lot easier than emulating a good one, right? So how do you define your problems if you're going to go into this business of trying to figure out how, say, the brain gives rise to the mind, or how you might produce an artificial mind? Having maybe the approach in response to these, I think, correct worries is just to kind of limit the goal in some ways, right? But you don't want to go too far, right? As you might say, well, if I've created some kind of visual detector, I've simulated really bad vision. I mean, that doesn't seem right. I mean, your cameras then your iPhone camera comes across as a kind of bad seeing thing, right? So how do you negotiate that? I think that's one of the issues probably that we would have to think about harder if we think that the Turing test is a bit too high of a bar.
So, Sandy, I'd like you to respond to this a little bit because, there's a lot of effort that's going into reconstructing in great detail the neural circuits of the mammalian brain, particularly of the rodent brain. €1 billion project, okay? So that's over $1 billion. And hundreds of computer scientists and biologists are involved in this endeavor. Do we need to know what the biology is? And how will the computer scientists take the algorithms that we learn to invoke more complicated, intelligent responses from an engineered device?
I guess
Do you want to take the mic?
My answer is somewhat related to what I think we've already heard here. It depends on the task. And so we can have very lofty goals like the big Euro project, but in the kind of a vacuum of not having a task or a specific function that you want that circuit to do, you're never going to probably reach a level of satisfaction. But if there's an agreement on a specific task, I'm actually fairly optimistic that some headway could be made.
So what's the task? Given what we know with these very dense reconstructions, what's the task that we can now simulate?
Well, at this point, I don't think we can simulate one, and that is the challenge of budding neuroscientists. But what is clear from a vantage point of somebody doing lots of experiments is one key ingredient is, and this also came up in the simulations, and in fact the simulations that you saw were from this Euro project, is that one neuron appears to partake in different ensemble activities. And this is something that we also see in the lab. And so how do you have this multiplexing of neural function? To understand that, the next thing we needed to do experimentally is to actually measure many behavioral parameters at the same time. So sort of the ideal experiment right now in the lab would be to image the animal's like foot pattern, if he's walking, get as many behavioral readouts as you could while you're simultaneously imaging the neural activity of, and my favorite scenario would be defined cell classes, as I spoke about, and then put that together and build simulations based on that information. And that might get you even closer to some of the AI things that we were just talking about.
So part of this question comes up not only because of the enormous investment, but also this sort of fanciful idea that perhaps if we knew all the circuits, all the wires, then we would be able to get closer to what makes you, and Wayne, and Dave, etc. So about a month ago, there was an article in the New York Times about a young woman who had a brain tumor. And she's actually an aspiring neuroscientist. She'd applied to a PhD program in neuroscience, and then she found out she had this brain tumor and she was going to die. And she decided she wanted to fix her brain to prepare it for potential electron microscopy for reconstruction, so that her brain would now be available for understanding the specific circuits that made her her. And it was incredibly poignant because I think many biologists don't believe that we're quite at that stage yet. But she and her boyfriend really were sort of hoping that they would get to talk again at some time in the future. Do you guys want to respond to that possibility, or that possibility now and that future possibility? So in other words, the idea of not replicating something that seems like a person, but seems like the person that you knew and that has the same recollections and the same experiences that you've shared.
So I was going to defer to the neurophysiologist, but so this is really, it's a heartbreaking case because I think this woman's hopes are really misplaced. It's virtually impossible that we have the technology now to preserve a brain well enough that you could slice it up later and reconstruct everything you would need to reproduce her brain structure in a way that it could be simulated, even had the ability to do the simulation. So, when you die, stuff starts deteriorating pretty quickly. And then they have to go through this preservation process, and there are still people working on preserving brain tissue in ways that doesn't destroy the tissue, and they're not there yet. So they did the best they could with her, but it seems obvious to me that her brain is just fried, or whatever, use whatever cooking metaphor you like, freezer burn. She's ruined. Her brain is ruined. And
well, it turned out the fixation, it cost $80,000, and the fixation was incomplete.
Yeah, they blew so that they did a CT scan or an MRI, and they found the fixation only got 20% of the brain or something. 80% hadn't been fixed properly. But even if they hadn't done that, the current state of the art in fixation is such that it's inconceivable that so much information wasn't destroyed by the fixation process to bring her back. But she's a special case because she died of a brain disease as opposed to dying of, say, a heart attack, where at least you have a normal brain, right? But she was losing brain function even before she died because of the tumor. So to reconstruct her brain, right, if you reconstructed it accurately, you'd be reconstructing somebody with a life-killing, life-threatening brain tumor, right, which may not be how they want to go through eternity. So what you really want to be able to do in her case is fix her broken brain to bring her back to a healthy brain. And that means you actually have to know what you're doing, right? As opposed to just having a really big simulator, right? If you had enough euros and a patient enough European Union, right, you could just keep pumping money into it. So you had this huge supercomputer. And if you only knew physics and knew nothing about how brains worked, but you had a good enough electron microscope and a big enough supercomputer, you could imagine simulating her diseased brain. But if you want to fix her diseased brain so it's not diseased anymore, now you actually have to know how brains work, right? And that's, in my opinion, centuries off at best.
You want to add anything to that, Sandy?
I guess just on the last point, I mean, I think you bring up an interesting question. Is it harder to fix a broken brain, than to construct one? I don't know, if you've ever worked with somebody's code, it's kind of easier to make a new code than fix. So. But on the other hand, in childhood epilepsy, it actually, on some level, you don't have to understand the brain, and they can actually take out chunks of brain. And because there's extreme plasticity or adaptability of the brain, it fixes itself. So maybe it is an easier problem, actually, to fix a brain if you can harness these plasticity mechanisms.
So, Wayne, you referred to something in your slides about, you had a nice slide with a brain on one side and a circuit board on the other. So there's the idea that we might see all the circuits, we could reconstruct all the circuits for somebody, and then perhaps that would be sufficient to give us some insight into their cognitive processes. But you made this distinction between the circuits and the mind. Can you tell us, elaborate on that a little bit? So even if we get the circuits, what's different about the mind?
So in that first slide that I showed you, the thought was...
Do you want your slides again?
No, it's okay. If you remember the two brains, right? So the thought was that not all circuitry is going to give rise to a mind or consciousness. And so there's one question, like what's special about certain circuits? Because you don't go from... You can't just read off, if you'd like, brain circuitry and say, oh, we have consciousness there, right? So, or it's a very hard problem to understand how to show those connections in a way that's informative, that you can understand why there's a mind there. So in that sense, brain doesn't equal mind, because certain parts of the brain don't give rise to the mind. That, of course, is consistent with saying what we all believe, which is, I think most of us believe, which is, of course, the mind is dependent on the brain. I think in these sort of reconstruction ideas, the idea of preserving brain function and hoping that in the future someone can reconstruct your mind, it does bring us back to the Turing's test and sort of how you would know that you've been successful because you've physically duplicated the brain. That's sufficient to give rise to the same mind. Is it sufficient to give rise to a mind? Let's say that the technology requires not that we do it in organic materials, but it's a lot easier to do it in inorganic materials. Again, the same questions are going to arise. So I think that's the gap, right? About thinking about a physical system like the circuit board there or the organic system on the other side, and recognizing that there aren't any sort of easy or clear connections that link those physical systems to the mental system, to the consciousness system. So does that sort of address the issue?
So Anind, maybe you can tell us exactly where do these sort of close enough systems, where do they start to fall short, right? So, we could build a brain from the bottom up by knowing all the circuits and then replicating their function in silico, for example, and then hoping that somehow is going to give rise to both correct responses and things that might be generative and witty and intelligent. But where are we now? And where do things really fall short? And what's the solution going to be to some of those problems?
Sort of tough question. So I think the places where we're falling short are, or that you see the biggest gaps, are when you're looking to represent a specific individual. It's certainly much easier to represent a general behavior or a general type of behavior, an angry person or a sad person or a happy person, people with particular kinds of affect. people that you've never met before, like the gentleman who was the Holocaust survivor, or this virtual therapist. There we tend to do better at, because we can say, well, they're at least close to somebody I know and I can kind of relate to them. But certainly we're nowhere close to being able to represent a specific individual to any degree. And I don't know, as Wayne was talking, I was trying to think, what would it take to start to represent that individual? And, that difference between mind and brain, I think, is crucial here. And just because someone, say, can think like someone I know, does that make them that person? Or do they need to have access to all of those memories? And what happens to those memories? When you replicate the brain, are you still getting access to those memories? I have no idea.
So I think memory is maybe a different subset of that might be interesting for us to discuss. But Sandy, I wanted to talk to you. I wanted you to tell us a little bit about what are we learning from the biology that helps these guys, right? Because some of this investment is not necessarily about replicating, our consciousness or Henry Markham's consciousness, or the consciousness of a rat whose brain they're reconstructing. But hopefully along the way, we'll sort of meet some milestones that will kind of make things better for cognitive computing. So is there a dialogue? What can we learn from studying these small circuits that's going to enable or facilitate improvements in what computer scientists can do?
I guess there might be two ways to answer the question. So do we need to funnel our data into a Henry Markram simulation environment, and then it goes to AI folks? That's one possibility, and that could perform some certain checks, because again, if a simulation becomes sufficient to recapitulate things that we've observed, that's satisfying, and that might be a litmus test, like, okay, feed that on up to AI. Or we could potentially skip the in silico and just try in our own labs, are we identifying some principles? So in thinking of going from brain to mind, even in our own living states, we have periods of sleep when we're not conscious, and when we're awake and we're conscious. And as I mentioned in the introduction, that is correlated with kind of brain patterns, and that you have highly synchronized neural activities when you're sleeping and desynchronized and awake. And maybe those are some clues. Another clue is actually in the visual system, you are getting light information that goes to your unconscious brain, your hypothalamus, about light levels. And that's what entrains our circadian rhythms. And we literally have a little biological clock that we are not consciously aware of. So if you're late at night getting blue light from your computer screens, unconsciously, a lot of brain activity is going on in response to that blue light. But at the same time, we're looking around the room, navigating, walking up and down the stairs, pulling down the seat, and sitting. And those are your conscious vision. And maybe just more carefully studying the differences between those brain processes in the lab could help inform AI. I mean, I don't know.
So right now, most of the flow is from computer science to neuroscience, and not the other way. We get inspiration from the fact that there are brains out there, and the neuroscientists, if they just do their thing, which is looking at things you can measure in a neuroscience lab, they don't really know what they're looking at that higher level. So what the computer scientists have been doing is trying everything they can think of, right? Oh, fractals sound good. Let's try that. How about chaos theory? How about Hopfield nets? How about backpropagation nets? How about production systems? They try all this crazy stuff, and it turns out the good news is that some of it's actually useful. So you can build useful stuff, which may not tell you anything about the brain, but you can make money that way. But they're also saying, gee, I wonder if this is in the brain. And for any X you can pick. There's some paper about, I found X in the brain. I found Hausdorff dimension 2.5 chaotic attractors in the rabbit olfactory bulb, right? So eventually what's going to happen is we're going to turn a corner. We're not there yet. We're going to turn a corner where eventually neuroscience is going to start telling computer scientists useful stuff that really is in the brain, right? We're not there yet, in part because it's very hard to see enough, right? You can record from a few neurons at once. When you can record from 1 million neurons at once, the story's going to be really different. But right now, a lot of the idea generation comes from the computer scientists trying any kind of crazy thing they can think of, and then hoping that the neuroscientists can use that language to talk about what they're seeing.
I would say also, I think it's important to remember that brains are biological systems that evolved with lots of constraints. And so the way they do things may not be the best way to accomplish cognition. It just is the local minima that they've settled into. And so it might be that there's inspiration from the biology, but it might also be that the biology will lead you down some false roads and that it's not necessarily useful. Sandy, you and I were talking earlier on about disease. And if, for example, we're not going to understand neural circuits in order to build a better computer or have sort of avatars that interact with us as if they're humans, what's the next best thing that we're going to get out of this understanding?
So of understanding, a biological understanding. Sure, and that's definitely a goal of lots of neuroscience labs. I guess AI has the goal of maybe making some money. In our lab, then the goal would be that maybe we could make some contributions to translational research. And again, looking at these very, in a cell type specific way, understanding what is this neuron type doing? Is it specifically broken in a disease? Can we rescue just the function of one neuron class and then fix the whole problem? And actually that there are becoming more and more examples of that in the literature.
I just want to add one thing. If you want one example where the theory actually has proved valuable, it's attractor neural networks. If you look up attractor neural networks, people have found good evidence for them in multiple brain areas. So it's not wishful thinking. People really believe that there are attractor networks in the brain. I wish there were more success stories like that, but at least we have one.
So I'm going to ask one more question before opening it up to all of you to talk to the panelists here. But I want to get back to mind, because in some sense, right, what we really value about each other is consciousness, right? Is the ability to interact with another mind where you can see that insight and you feel that connection. And so, we might have a lot of circuits, but the mind is something that might be a little bit different. How necessary is it for us? Can we succeed without mind? And I'd like to address that to the philosopher here.
Can we succeed? No. Sure. If this poor woman who died of a brain tumor, if there was some way to have preserved the structures in her brain that we all agree were sufficient to give rise to her unique mind, if you were able to simulate that somehow, and there are plenty of science fiction movies that involve this sort of idea, right, or novels and so forth, like if you were able to kind of replicate that, you might still feel uncomfortable as one of her loved ones interacting with a system, yet you somehow downloaded her thoughts and memories into, a circuit board there that is now producing responses like she would have if she was still alive. And this is the value of the mind, right? This is the question about whether you've done it successfully. Like, is it enough just that you've simulated it really well, that you've passed Turing's test? So that the hardest Turing test to pass would be having her interact with her loved ones. Right? It's one thing to interact with a sort of objective judge who doesn't really know her, but if she could even do that, you might just feel, and this is probably what some of you feel about Turing's test, that it's just mere simulation. It would only be a kind of replica of her, a kind of Xerox copy, and that's just not valuable enough. Even if you agree that she had a mind, it would either be that she doesn't really have one, the system, she's not really there, or if in a sense it did do it, then it's a mind, but it's not really her. So these are really hard questions that sort of push us to ethics and our values of how we value individuals and social interactions. And I think those are questions that we don't immediately think about, right? Because one of the questions that we want to deal with here is how to even just get to that point where you think you might have a mind. But it's got broader ramifications, and I think that's important to see.
So I'd like to take this opportunity now to let people in the audience ask questions, and I think we can pass around the mic just so that everybody can hear. So back here, Jim. Well, we're taping it. Might be useful.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks for the comments. I think this is really fascinating stuff. So my question sort of builds on the last set of comments. I'm thinking about you look at a brain or you look at a computer, and from the outside you couldn't possibly know what's going on. And it's kind of an issue of accumulated experience over time. That's what makes us all individuals. So I'm wondering if you could address something about, this is more really for the neuroscientists, is that accumulated experience something that is being explored? Do we understand how a brain and a mind develops based on what they're exposed to over the life history of their experience? Do we understand how memory works? Do we understand how these kind of things can be recalled? Do we have two rats that have exactly the same experiences and have exactly the same brain?
I mean, I guess there's kind of two fields of studies that are addressing that. One is something called critical period plasticity, this idea that your early life experiences during, especially in particular when you're young, have a very potent impact on brain function. And then, based on how that impact is, you will further set kind of your lifelong learning. And yeah, there's research going on here and many universities on this critical period plasticity. In terms of memory, that's typically studied, unfortunately, by a different set of neuroscientists. And that's thought to, a lot of attention is put into the hippocampus, a specific brain region, and understanding how you first recognize kind of a novel scenario, you store that information, and then you have to consolidate and shift that information into different brain areas. So quite a bit of work is going on those levels.
Yeah, I would just add, I think one of the really interesting things about trying to see the physical changes that happen in memory, for example, requires not only a structural understanding of how neurons talk to each other, but there's a number of other dynamic things that are happening. For example, Sandy mentioned circadian rhythms, right? You have all these sort of hormonal influences, neuromodulators, epigenetic modifications to DNA that change the responsivity of a cell. And so it's the information is not just contained in the structure, it's contained in the dynamics as well. And so it might be that to capture all of that, you need not only a physical anatomical circuit sort of diagram, but you also need to know something about how those pieces worked with each other, which can be very individual. Other questions?
Yeah. I just follow on your last comment. And I think currently we are assuming everything on a deterministic framework. So essentially we are thinking of connectivities determines where the consciousness come from. But what if that's not the case? What if it's a dynamic, as the moderator just pointed out, that controls where the consciousness come from? Then all this brain circuitry and hoping that the circuitry will determine where the memory forms, it's all will throw out of the window, and it doesn't work that way.
I think this is a question for Wayne, really. Sort of Cartesian, you know. Can we take the brain and extract from that something that's sort of more dynamic?
Was it a question for me? Well, so the thought was, I guess if I understand it, we've been focusing on something more static in the sense of connections. And the thought was that if you could reproduce that, that would be enough to reproduce consciousness. And then the alternative thought was that, well, you have to think about the dynamic aspects of it, and that might not follow from simply just looking at the connections. Something to that effect. That might be right. I mean, this question about going from either of these two cases to consciousness and the mind, I think what I meant earlier when I said, you know, those bridges are not so clear, is partly informed by these, you know, alternative possibilities, right? It's not going to be easy to answer how something like consciousness comes about. It may be that thinking too statically about it may not be the right way to go about it. So in that sense, I agree. I think the possibilities of how to explain how you get a mind or consciousness from a physical structure like either of these two cases, I think is an open question. So I think that's right. I mean, at least we should be open to these alternatives.
Over here.
So I have a point and a question. Well, so the first one is if you actually read Turing's original article, the description of the imitation game was not like the end-all be-all, you know, definition of consciousness. It was a minimum barrier of entry to an intelligent machine. And, you know, somehow the Turing test has been morphed into this ultimatum that once we pass it, we will have, computerized consciousness. But that's not what Turing intended. So we kind of are relying on this old way of thinking about intelligence and consciousness that I think is biasing where the discussion and where our research is going. That was my point. My question is that when we're talking about things like consciousness, memory, perception, these are kind of philosophical constructs that have very difficult operational definitions. So where can we find a bridge between the operationalized terms like what Sandy uses with, finding very specific stimuli to engage very specific neuron ensembles and something like memory or decision making? Where can we start to build those bridges?
Well,
back to you, Wayne.
So something about the point. So that's right. I mean, I gave you Turing's original question, which was, can machines think? And the beauty of what he did was to say, I'm going to change that question, and I'm going to provide you a test for that. And I think I meant in some ways, Tim, to sort of leave open the issues that you just raised in terms of that point, which is to say, if you don't like that test, if that's not the appropriate test, we need to come up with another one. And I think that connects to your question, which is about operationalizing something. So if you want a definition of consciousness, you're not going to find one. Okay.
Just full disclosure here, I asked Wayne earlier on if he could provide a definition of consciousness, and he said no.
Right. So there is no, but I would also point out that to study a lot of things in natural science, you don't need to define them. Right? If you're observing tigers, you don't have to tell me exactly what a tiger is, as long as you can track it. So I think if we're studying consciousness, which seems kind of ineffable in some ways, because it's really hard to describe, no one's got a definition of it, it might be enough that you can track it. So if you want to study imagery, some of you have studied, well, all right, as long as you can generate images consistently and you can report that, that might be enough to get at that, right? At least to see correlates at brain level. So definitions are not going to be present for that, but I think you're right. I mean, that leaves open this challenge of how then do we fix our understanding of mental phenomenon in a way that we can really do some, good work in connecting then the brain or artificial systems to that. I don't have an answer to that, Tim, but I think it's good to highlight that that's part of the major challenge.
A question over here, I think you have the mic.
Yes, this is, I think this is kind of a follow-up.
Can you hold it a little?
Yes, certainly. This is a follow-up, and I hope you'll forgive me. I will formulate my question on
We
the
can't
fly.
hear very well.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to formulate my question on the fly, and I will also first make a point and then ask a question. It'll be easier for me this way. So regarding the Turing test, one of the things that always have bothered me about it is not so much the machines that do not pass the test, but human beings. Like, let's say, human being doesn't pass the Turing test. What does this mean? I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty of them that do not. And then what does this mean? Do they not have a mind, a consciousness? And then starting to think about this a bit more, we're using these constructs like memory, perception, but there are individuals, for example, who lose all of their memory. And there are individuals who, for example, do not have visual perception, at least sometimes. They do not have even tactile perception, but they could potentially still be aware, right? There could still be consciousness there. And from both philosophical and, I guess, neuroscience perspective, how do you think, what happens once you reduce? I mean, essentially, an electronic brain is the brain that doesn't receive necessarily visual input, other kinds of input. It might not have memory to start with, memory of specific events. So what's left then? I guess that's my question.
So it's not clear that a human being who never had any sensory input would be recognizable as human. People who in adulthood lose, say, vision or hearing or both, their minds were formed by their sensory experiences. And so then you could say, well, they're aware, they just can't communicate, at least through those modalities. But if you took a human baby, and this is a horrible thing to think about, and disconnected it from sensory input, it's unlikely that it would even survive, right? And if you were able to keep it alive, it's unlikely that it would develop in a way that would be recognizably human. So I'm not sure it makes sense to say that somebody could fail the Turing test because they're blind or deaf. Well, the Turing test is just it's suggestive of a way of demonstrating a mental capacity, right? And if you can't see, well, then we'll give you the test auditorily, and if you can't see or hear, then we'll do it by tapping on your skin, right? But if there's some way that you can demonstrate complex mental processes, you could, in theory, pass the Turing test. But if there's nothing there, right? If you've been disconnected from the sensorium from conception, and there's just nothing there, then the fact that you have the same chromosome count as everybody else doesn't really make you human, in my opinion.
Can I just add something to that, which is I think the thing about your worry about the test is that passing it is not meant to be a necessary condition for having a mind. So if you failed it, that doesn't show that you're lacking a mind, right? So, but going back to a lot of issues that have come up, is it sufficient? Well, yeah, if something passed it, you might really think very hard about whether or not that system has a mind. But if you don't like the test, I go back to this issue of like, yeah, let's think hard about, how are we going to test for success in replicating conscious vision, or, being able to imagine something, or just being able to do, math in a way that humans do math, in a way that involves a mind, as opposed to merely just like simulating it. Like, so maybe, the Jeopardy champion does certain things, but the way he or she does it is going to involve lots of mental processing. And that might not have been replicated in these systems that outperform human beings. So, what tests are we going to replace Turing's test with if we don't like it? So I think that's also an important question to keep in mind.
I think we have time for one last question, so two last questions. Okay.
Thank you for taking the question and coming. One possible answer I read about for an alternative to the Turing test was called the Lovejoy test, asking the computer to be creative, write a poem, write a song, don't just respond, make something on your own. The question I had for Sandy from a neurobiological point of view is need function of, in other words, necessity is the mother of invention. We need something, we need to live, we need to survive. Do neurons behave differently if they're hungry? Or they're lonely, and can I write a computer program when I threaten to pull the plug? He's going to start answering the questions properly. So is need an integral part of artificial intelligence? Thank you.
So I guess I can start off the answer to that question and maybe link back to what Tim was talking about a little bit with decision. So certainly, if an animal, at least a rodent that we study in the lab, is hungry, he will do very different things than if he's not. So clearly that, in terms of the biological brain, that is fundamental to decision making. So a choice of whether to go out and forage during the day, which would normally not be a safe time. There are animals more apt to do dangerous things if it's hungry. So we know that's how biological brains work. I don't know, is it necessary to incorporate that into a machine context?
You could probably program it in, right, Anind? Just make it do that.
Yeah, I mean, if we imagine that we don't have the compute power to represent the brain, and so that we're sort of optimizing how we're leveraging that computing power, and there's this threat, essentially, to its performance, then it can sort of shift how it's spending its computing power more towards this. But I think the question you asked is much more subtle. I don't think so. I really just don't think so.
Okay.
Okay. So I have another potential kind of test to replace the Turing test to know if something is in fact sentient or conscious. So basically, it's a kind of know it when you see it thing, where right now we know
sort of like the pornography test.
No. I know it's the same words, but it's a different meaning. A I'm a fallibilist, so I believe that knowledge consists of explanation. So if we knew what consciousness was, and we knew what the algorithmic process was behind it, we could explain it. So right now, because we're lacking the knowledge, we're looking for some empirical test. But this is not really an empirical thing in the same way that if you're thinking about pure math, it's not empirical, right? Something, what makes up a triangle or what makes up consciousness is something that you understand in a knowledgeable way. So we know, for example, that a intelligent system would have to have some type of representation for knowledge, and we know that to be conscious like a human, you must have sense perception, so qualia, and we don't really have very good definitions for these things. But if we found the algorithmic process, then we would be able to create a definition, and we would know what that was, and we would know it was conscious. And if we found a definition for that, then we could definitely create an algorithmic process, and then we can use the definition to show that the algorithmic process achieves it, and then we would also know that that was sentient.
So panelists, do you have an opinion about that?
I think in some sense, I guess, back to the is this pornography question, I don't know how we'd get to that definition that would be sufficient for us to create the algorithmic process. I don't know how the others feel on this panel, but I think that would be a huge challenge that I don't think we're prepared to answer, at least at this point.
So I think the word consciousness is like the word cool. It's a social construct and not a physically measurable phenomenon, and so consciousness is what we define it to be.
All right, we have one last question here.
All right. I have a very simple question because I'm a layman, and my understanding is that Homo sapiens, somewhere around 70 million years ago, developed the ability to think abstractly. Cognizance, I guess you can call it. Forgetting about computers, I'm not sure who's who here in terms of neurological work or research, but I'd like to ask the most basic question of all. Do we have any hints? We seem to know quite a bit through imagery about objective actions that we take, physical actions. Do we have any hints whatsoever about anything having to do with studying abstract thinking whatsoever? Forget about memory, anything whatsoever that for the future you see us going into that direction. That's, again, I'm a layman and I'm just asking a really very simple question. I don't want to...
So a good example of abstract thinking is reasoning about numbers. And there is a lot of literature on the development of numeracy in kids. I don't know that literature. We should have had a psychologist on the panel as well. But that's a place I think you could look for development of abstract reasoning. The whole developmental process in kids has been studied extensively. They're not born able to reason abstractly, and they don't really get good at it until high school.
Right, but the physical workings, that's what I'm getting at.
Oh, like the brain circuitry?
We understand psychology, but do we have any hints as to future research in terms of studying the brain's ability to think abstractly? Not from a psychological point, but...
So I imagine that the way to study that right now, the best technology now would be fMRI studies of people engaged in functional magnetic resonance imaging. So actually one of the slides that Wayne showed had some fMRI images of a brain, the one where the person heard the sound versus didn't hear the sound, and different parts of the brain were lighting up. So that seems to be if you wanted to study that kind of thing, and I think people are, that would be the way to do it right now, is at this gross level of what parts of the brain are lighting up and what parts aren't.
So I want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. I think it's been a really stimulating discussion. and invite you all to a reception outside the room here. So thanks, everybody.